I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest today is Ron Fennel, former member of the Georgia House of Representatives and of the legendary Four Horsemen, and an aide to Governor Senator Zell Miller. Welcome.
Thank you, Bob.
Odom, Georgia.
It's a small town. When we grew up there, those of us in the farming communities who understood what it meant to go to town, that meant to go to Odom. And when you went to the city, it was to Jessup. And when you went to the big city, it was to Brunswick. So small town America is a part of an awful lot of folks' lives who get involved in something bigger than themselves, like public service. And I think it's an inspiration when you grow up out in the country and your family has all been farmers from the time you came over, and you see things that need to be done. And if you ever get an opportunity and you're given an education, you want to go out and do something with it. And that humble origin remains a part of who I am.
And then I believe you went to college at Georgia Southern.
I did. After St. Simon's Elementary, after I left Odom, went over to Glenn County where my dad was a home builder. He and his brother built homes on St. Simon's and Sea Island for 40 years. And I had the opportunity to go to Glenn Academy and then on to Georgia Southern. I was going to be a doctor. My mission, I went there on a chemistry scholarship. I'm going to study to be a doctor. I got derailed along the way because I found that I enjoyed getting involved in different organizations on campus, and I grew one into the other. And of course I ran for student government president. The whole chemistry department was totally alien with the concept of somebody wanting to do this. I had the head of the department build a helium balloon in the basement of the chemistry building and fill it with helium with my name on it. It was very bizarre. But we had a great time, and I enjoyed public service to that point. And while I was running for student government president, something happened that changed the course and direction of my life. And it was as I was writing articles in the local newspaper, the school newspaper, I read one issue where this fellow was coming to campus. I didn't know who he was. He had a funny sounding name, and apparently he was running for re-election and he was going to give a talk. Well, one of my platforms as a candidate for president of the student government was to get university status for Georgia Southern College at that time. And I said, well, I don't know who this fellow is, but he sounds important. I'm going to go over there and see if he could help us out. So I sat through an hour-long speech, and afterwards there was a reception, and he and his young aide walked into the room, and I dove into him. And he was at this reception for about an hour, and after 20 minutes, Zell Miller looked at me and said, I want to help you, but if you'll talk to my aide and let him get your information, there's some other folks who'd like to talk to me. Do you mind? So it was that moment that I met Zell Miller, and I didn't know it at the time, but he changed the direction of how my life would go, and I'm grateful.
Is that when you first got interested in politics?
Well, I was interested in it, but I didn't know there was an avenue to do something about it until I met him, and then a few months later got an opportunity when I got a phone call from his office. Mm-hmm. And that phone call was from Rick Hutto, the aide in question. Mm-hmm. And Rick, who is now a member of the Macon City Council, who married a young lady from Princeton whose roommate in college at Princeton went on to marry a fellow in the Middle East, and she's now known as Queen Noor of Jordan. So anyway, but Rick Hutto was the aide to Zell Miller that traveled with him on that trip, and he informed me by phone, I'm leaving to go to work in the Carter White House, and Miller has asked me to find somebody to replace me in this job. And he said, how about calling that fellow down there that at Georgia Southern that was annoying us so much? Something to that effect.
So you were with Miller for, what, 4 years?
4 years, pretty much on a consecutive basis. He gave me every odd job that you could hope for as a young, interested political person, intern, doorkeeper, general, go fetch this and aid, And then as it grew, being able to provide a little bit more feedback and a little more input for him.
That's what I learned a long time ago, was a hat and coat man.
That's right. How about a cup of coffee? I've lost my pen. I don't know how a man can stand in one place presiding over the Senate and lose 10 felt tip pens in one day, but I've seen it done. And it's a miracle of magic that I don't yet quite understand, but I was there ready with another pen.
How was it working for Miller?
It was terrific as a learning experience. It was challenging because as the Marine Corps drill sergeant, in him always demanded the best, expected the best. He was a workaholic himself, and if you didn't try to emulate that, you weren't keeping up. And it made all of us around him better, and we tried to learn every day from him, and just nuances. We could learn just by watching a few little items, and we all tried to do that and tried to make it better in his office, and it was a lot of fun.
You were there during his 1980 campaign for the United States Senate. What do you remember about that?
Well, I remember driving him an awful lot across different parts of the state and flying in little puddle jumper airplanes, both in that campaign and then later on in the '84 campaign where we were trying to help Walter Mondale. But I remember dropping him off one night somewhere in the middle of godforsaken nowhere, and it was about 10:20. We had a long, hard day, worked an awful lot, and he said, "We don't have to get an early start tomorrow. You can pick me up around 5:30. And I got there at 5:20 and he was already waiting on me. So it gave you the understanding and appreciation for the man and his drive and his energy. And it took a lot for all of us to keep up with it.
Many people were, I guess, disappointed is the word when Miller failed to win the Democratic nomination. Is that not true?
It is. I remember I was in the office on his birthday. In 1980. When he came out, we were trying to celebrate his birthday, and he didn't like that celebration, the birthday cake and all that nonsense. He's more interested in talking about and thinking about the campaign, and he came out of his pocket with a handmade brochure, and the phrase, "Best Senator Money Can't Buy," was seen for the first time among the staff. And I remember thinking, that's not going to work. But I, the most junior member, wasn't going to say anything. I got the point and I understood what his reference was to Senator Talmadge, but he had so much in the way of positive attributes and offerings that the people of Georgia would have readily responded to, rather than that tact of trying to point out that Senator Talmadge was challenged. And I think that was my biggest disappointment of that year, apart from the fact that he lost the nomination. Ironically, the guy whose office I later rented to run my state legislative race was Mac Mattingly. So, and I grew up around him while I was at school. I would go to Georgia Southern. His daughter and I went to school together, so I would frequently stop by and pick her up. And so I'd have to chat with Mac Mattingly. And a couple years later, here he was elected to the United States Senate, and I was baffled that Georgians could opt, for inexperience and a disconnect in a lot of people's minds, as opposed to a more informed and energetic choice. But it was an interesting campaign of 1980.
Well, from Miller, I believe you held several positions in the state party.
I did.
Democratic.
Let me go to one point. I want to get this on the record, because the first time I ever heard the name Bob Short, I thought it was an invention, that this wasn't a real person. And I'll tell you why. Whenever I went to work for Zell Miller in '79, I would occasionally be tasked at lunchtime, when the girls would go to lunch, just answering the phone. And I would get an operator call, collect call for Bob Short. Well, the first couple of times I had no clue what to do with it. And finally, Marty Pingree came out and said, "Oh, that's Miller calling from the road. Just refuse the charges and get the number and we'll call him back." So we used the Watts line. I think the statute of limitations has run out, so AT&T's not going to chase us down Bell South at the time. But this was a way to save money, using the Watts line to call out, but not being able to call in from a payphone, and they still had plenty of payphones back in the day. But Miller would travel everywhere and call into the office to get messages and check in, and he would call in, collect call for Bob Short. I don't know if you knew that, but that's how, for years, I didn't know you actually existed until I finally met you. So I wanted to make sure that was on the record, because it was an entertaining and an educational thing, because he was saving money for the taxpayers by calling back on the wide area telephone system network at reduced rates, as opposed to calling collect and having to pay for the fees.
Well, thanks. I never knew that. I never knew that. But from Miller's office as Lieutenant Governor, you held several positions in the state Democratic Party.
I did.
Tell us about that.
Well, it was a lot of fun. Miller introduced me to an awful lot of the people, and having been a party operative himself, he understood that is a great proving ground for an awful lot of people, and he gave me an opportunity by introducing me to these people. I became a part of the staff. I worked for Tommy Coleman. When he was executive director, I was the first executive director of the Young Democrats of Georgia, the first one. It was a position a lot of young folks felt like was needed. We were a very active chapter of the Young Democrats, and so I did an awful lot of things there. Grew that into a number of areas of service, and then became field director of the party in '84 at Miller's request. He was lieutenant governor, but he was actually helping a candidate running for president, and he needed somebody over there. And he said, I need somebody over there who'll run it the way I would. I can't be there. The legislature's going to have me tied up. I want you to go over there and do that. And so on his behalf, I did that and worked the field operation for the state. Ironically, we were basing our office in Atlanta, but Andrew Young was the mayor of Atlanta. We kept getting into priority differences. He thought all the resources ought to be spent on getting out the vote in Atlanta, which was, a laudable goal, but I had more of a mission than that, to help win more of the state. And so after a couple of fights, as it were, internally and behind the scenes, I went to him and I crafted a 3-page memo to ZM from RF, and he had Martha retype it, and it said memo to RF from ZM, and it was everything that I had written, which was flattering, but it was a mission statement and it was a plan of action, and we took it and ran with it. And I moved my offices to Macon, where George Israel was the mayor. We ran our campaign there. They even brought Ronald Reagan to town to Macon. We won Bibb County at the end of the day. So I'm proud of the operation we had. Obviously, we didn't win the state or the national election, but we did what we could. And I remember Andrew Young had an opportunity to be confronted about those of us in the campaign, and he called us SAWBs. If you remember this term, I'll pardon but the historical record should reflect. Called us smart-ass white boys, because we felt like we knew what we needed to do. And very soon thereafter, Burt Lance and a couple of the others stepped in, mollified the situation. We had a reception with Mondale out at Ann Cox Chambers' house, and there at that evening, all of us gathered around. Andy Young came out of his briefcase and handed each of us who were on the team an SAWB button. And he said, you white boys are smarter than I thought you were. So it was one of those moments where you appreciated being involved in the battles, but being on the same team. And so that operation as a field director gave me an awful lot of experience and a lot of enjoyment. And later on, Miller asked me, when he became governor, to be executive director of the party. And that was a great privilege and an honor to do that. I did that for almost a year. It was mostly a fundraising position at that point, part of the business I hated, still do to this day, but as a necessary part. We raised about $1 million in less than a year, and at that time that was a record. There were a lot of good people who were doing the fundraising, but it wasn't a role that I preferred. I preferred the more nuts and bolts, more field operation, more grassroots. And so I did my 15 years of service to the Democratic Party, from being a member of the local committee, my local county chair, my Senate district chair, field director, Young Democrats president, and on an executive director. So after 15 years, I felt like that was an ample service to my party, and I'm proud of it, but that was enough.
Well, Ron, while we're on the subject of parties, let's talk a little bit about Georgia becoming a two-party state after, 137 years
Right.
of Democratic rule. How do you define that growth?
Georgia has always been a conservative-leaning state, always. Probably always will be. Atlanta, urban areas have more folks who vote Democratic on a consistent basis, but Georgia as a whole is a conservative state. We voted nationally most every time for the more conservative candidate unless we had a reason. If Lyndon Johnson stands up with the governor and puts his hand around John Kennedy and said, this guy will be all right for us, then we have a tendency to support that candidate. Or a native son like Jimmy Carter, or almost native son like Bill Clinton. But otherwise, we've pretty well selected on a national basis the more conservative candidate on the national ticket. So it's not surprising that we've had that bent, but it is surprising in some of the elections because we've had some political lions that have been Democrats in Georgia that have endured over a long span, from Carl Vinson to Richard Russell to Tom Murphy to the Zell Millers, that had a long reign as a Democrat incumbent who happened to have a conservative philosophy of government, balancing the budget, encouraging a strong defense, supporting the Second Amendment, a lot of things that people consider to be on a national basis now just automatic Republican-based issue-oriented philosophies. It's always been the part of Georgia's mindset and behavior.
Some disenchanted Democrats believe that their party is too liberal, too urban, too dependent on minority and labor votes. Is that fair to say?
There's a lot of truth in elements of that. For rural Georgians, unions have never been a part of their experience. For rural Georgians, urban crises and challenges and issues have never been really a part of their makeup. So they don't identify well with those. So when the issues that are forwarded by, in this case, the modern Democratic Party on the national basis, they focus on those types of issues. And, the little guy living out in, Hayhira or Odom doesn't quite connect with those issues. You're not talking about my issues. And so it makes it easy for them to seek an alternative. And the alternative has always been, well, this party seems to be a lot more identifying with my conservative values. Mm-hmm. So I think that has changed the way party perception among Georgians has allowed for a turn. And I watched it up close. I had already left the legislature. I remember I left as executive director of the party at the end of 1991. Handed the keys over to Scotty Greenwood, and she was the last executive director to preside over a majority in the congressional delegation. In 92, we elected Republicans, and we had one Republican in the congressional delegation when I was executive director, a fellow by the name of Newt Gingrich. I don't know whatever happened to him. But it was 80% Democrat legislature, House and Senate. You had every constitutional officer filled with a Democrat, no prospect for a Republican even to get more than 40%. It was a different day as recently as 92 in that regard, and then 94 happened in the Newt Gingrich revolution in Washington, and all those things that occurred thereafter.
How difficult will it be for the Democrats to regain a majority in the state legislature?
I think we're down to 68 as of this week, Democrats in the House. That is a daunting challenge. I remember when I came into the legislature, the Republicans had 62 or 63 seats. They felt totally disenfranchised, were never heard, and God love him, Tom Murphy made sure of that in the House. We had a different dynamic working, even though most of us who were moderates, however you term that, Many of the young faces that came in were a little more progressive, but we weren't considered liberal, a couple maybe, but mostly we were moderates, and we were just looking to operate in this environment which was trending more conservative. And then the Lions had been there, like Tom Murphy was a conservative, bona fide, had all the credentials in the papers, but still remained a Democrat. So it was an interesting dichotomy to live through.
What do you think of the great number of Democrats who have switched parties in order to hold on to their seats?
That's if you will resign your seat. I'll tell you the one example that impressed me the most, and that was in Texas. A Georgia boy by the name of Phil Graham, University of Georgia product. He resigned his seat in Congress because he said the party had left him. They held a special election. He ran as a Republican and got himself elected. That's the way to do it. If you're honest with the voters, I am no longer a member of this party. I can no longer serve, therefore, as the party's nominee and elected representative. I'm okay with that. But when you switch after you've been elected, I've got a little bit more of a challenge and a problem with that.
Let me ask you this question.
Sure.
If you were in office today, would you still be a Democrat?
It'd be more difficult for me. Where I represented Glenn County in the legislature, Brunswick, part of coastal Georgia, St. Simons and Jekyll in that area. It would be very challenging, even though my district, as it was carved at the time, was pretty much a 50-50 district. And remember, I was elected to the legislature having defeated an incumbent Republican, the only one that year to be defeated in the entire legislature, House or Senate. So I was one of those unique guys. I remember Buddy Darden had a similar distinction in 1980 when he was elected in that race. He was the only one. As the trend went and waved Republican, he got elected in that unique situation too. But for now, where I live in Cobb County, I live in Smyrna, so I'm in South Cobb. But I mean, I could probably still get elected as a Democrat in some parts of the county. Much like that dividing line that Buddy used to talk about between the East and the West, but it would be a little bit more challenging. My views are still pretty much where they were all along. Most of us have strong conservative views on a number of issues, and we're pretty socially compassionate. And I consider Tom Murphy the first compassionate conservative I ever met. I heard it later on used to identify the Bush family or Ronald Reagan. Tom Murphy was the original conservative who was compassionate that I saw with my own eyes.
So you're elected in 1988.
Correct.
And you defeated. Tell us about that campaign.
Well, growing up, you think about things that you want to do in life, and this never was on my radar screen till I met Miller. And after I saw how it operated and how an opportunity to serve existed, I started studying it. And I ran for the legislature in '86, and I lost by four votes in the Democratic primary to a local political legend who went on to serve two terms on the county commission and 3 terms in the state house. But after I was out, that's another story, and we'll get into it in a little bit. But I lost by 4 votes. After having campaigned for well over a year, I'd worked my construction job. I worked in the family construction business. We built houses, so 7 o'clock in the morning I had to make sure we had materials on the job site and that the right guys showed up and knew where to go and what to do. And I had to stay and make sure everything was buttoned up at the end of the day. So 4 o'clock, I'm taking a shower, putting on my white shirt, my tie, and I'm knocking on doors with brochures until dark. Did that an awful lot, like a lot of candidates. And after having done that part-time for a year, and to lose by 4 votes was quite traumatic. And you know, back then as today, candidates stand near the polling places and they wave at voters by holding a sign and give that last visual image before a voter goes in. I watched a later model car, a large car, 5 guys drove up, had my opponent's bumper sticker on there, and they drove up and they were laughing and waving, hey! And they drove up, parked, and went in the polling place at 5 minutes till 7 p.m. Those 5 gentlemen cast ballots that I watched, which defeated me. It was very seared on my brain at that point. But I lost to an interesting fellow, Reverend E.C. Tillman. Shiloh Baptist Church, the largest African American congregation between Savannah and probably Orlando. And he marched with Dr. King in Daytona Beach. He was a bona fide legend, had been school board member, etc. And he had been the nominee twice before, and this was his third time getting the nomination, and lost to two different Republicans. So it was obvious that the voters in that district, while they may have been able to elect a Democrat, just chose that it was not his time and that he was not the right person. But that didn't help me any, having lost by 4 votes. So I had to spend the next 2 years working at it to go again. Well, the month after the election was over and Reverend Tillman lost, we had our local Democratic Party meeting, and I had been active there for a few years. And I went to that meeting, and I stood up whenever the chairman said, "Anybody have anything you want to offer as regards the election?" And I stood up and I congratulated the Reverend on running a great race, and I appreciated it. But I am now a candidate for the next time around. We've given the Reverend 3 times, and I'd like to just put everyone on notice that I'm running right now for the next time around, and I'd appreciate everybody's support. And so I put that out. And then when you're in your 20s and you do that, and all the old guard is sitting there, it makes them sit up and take notice. And you know, those of us who are young and brash and really wanted to serve, I didn't run against him, I just ran for the job. And I wanted to make sure that I had my head start that I had missed out on the time before. As it happened the following year, he and I worked out an arrangement. I lost in the absentee box. I was up by 53 votes until they opened the absentees. I didn't have an absentee precinct coordinator or manager or whatever, but I found out who his was. And the day after I found out who it was, I went and knocked on her door, and I sat on her porch for 3 hours, and we became fast friends. And the next time around, she was my absentee ballot coordinator, and we won. It was a great privilege to run a campaign where I just talked about what I wanted to do, why I wanted the job, and I just acted like that was an open seat. I never mentioned my opponent, never responded to anything. My opponent ran like a challenger, attacking me, attacking my lack of a record, and saying bad things about me. I just ignored it and ran a campaign for the job. And the voters of my district saw fit to hire me. And so it was a great moment. And like I say, I ran my campaign out of Mac Mattingly's old typewriter shop there in town. It had a historical significance that I couldn't overlook as an ironic twist. So,
So January 1989, you went to the Capitol.
You know, when you walk in that building, I don't care who you are, if you have any sense of history and an appreciation for the value that your government has, you get chills walking in the building. And I did that day. I was trembling when I put my hand on the Bible and raised my hand, and Tom Murphy said, "Repeat after me," and we all had the oath and were sworn in. And he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you've hereby been sworn in. Be prepared hereafter to be sworn at." And it set the tone for those of us. And I looked around in this august body, and I saw this ornate structure and this history, and I said, man, how did I get here? And after the second or third day, I looked over and I said, how did he get here? And then how the heck did he get here? And I guess that's what happens when good people don't vote. At least that was my conclusion.
Well, who were some of your friends?
Well, it was a great treat to come in with an awful lot of folks, Democrats and Republicans, that are friends to this day. There was a small group of us. We had 23 Democrats in our crowd, and I think there were 12 or 13 Republicans. Earl Earhart was in that group. We had, in the Democratic contingent, we had quite an interesting bunch. Cynthia McKinney to Judy Pogue, the former sheriff of Murray County. Yes, his nickname was Judy. Don't ask me to explain that. we had Karen Irwin, who served just a term. We had a couple of people that spent some time. A guy named Thurbert Baker, I'm not sure really what happened to him, but his going on to become Attorney General was a proud moment for a lot of us to know that he had the confidence of the governor. But there was this group that kind of whittled itself down and became fast friends. 4 young, 30-year-old, aggressive, semi-polished, aggressive, active young guys. We're all single, and we had a blast. It was
4 horsemen.
The newspaper dubbed us the 4 Horsemen. I'm not sure where that term came from for the reporter. We were termed a lot of different things, but it was Doug Teeper, whom I had met many years before when I was on the campus at Georgia Southern. I was writing an article for the local newspaper, for the school newspaper, the Georgian. And I was writing a story about this organization trying to be created on campus, GAIN, Georgians Against Nuclear Energy. Well, at the time I was in the chemistry program and I was studying nuclear chemistry, and I was actually pro-nuclear. I thought it was a great alternative energy source. But I was a reporter on this story, and 14 people showed up to organize this chapter, and they needed 15. I didn't have a story, so I joined the chapter as a pro-nuke in order to get the story, and Doug Teeper was the organizer of that meeting. So I met these young, he had a giant afro, he was a wild child, and I learned an awful lot about his history over time at the University of Georgia, and his running for student government president, the unknown candidate, the race for Congress, all the rest. But there are 10,000 Doug Teeper stories, and you ought to get those straight from the horse's mouth. But Ray Holland, very bright lawyer, extremely focused, and a guy who had perfection written all over him. And in Southwest Georgia, I didn't understand how perfection could get elected. Here's a guy who might have been in a pickup truck in his life. He used a picture of one on his campaign brochure, but he drove a red Corvette. His hair was always perfectly in place. His suits were Brooks Brothers and well-tailored. He was extremely detailed in everything, and a very bright lawyer. How does somebody like that get elected from farm country in Southwest Georgia? We didn't understand. But not only did he get elected, he beat every other challenger in an open primary. His first time out, he beat 5 opponents without a runoff. So it was here's a guy who everybody understands, he's the smartest kid in the room. Let's bring him and let him be our guy. And so he was the one, and then my buddy McCracken Poston, who has gone on to do some incredible things, but in that freshman class it was obvious he was the guy who had the angle on how to communicate the message best. He has a grasp of the issues readily. He's very smart, obviously, but he also went with 2 things in mind, I think. One, he wanted to do a great job for his area of the state and look after folks. And he later grew more and more attuned to the constituent service component. But in the beginning, we wanted to just get noticed, and we did. And Tom Murphy and the leadership embraced us, sort of cocooned. For whatever reason, the 4 of us sort of became the fair-haired children. I'm sure frustrated an awful lot of folks watching, particularly those who had been around a little bit longer, and the Larry Terry group. But it was fun in that first period of time to make sure we were on the team. They were making sure that we were catered to some degree. And it was fun. We all became happy and maybe a little too cocky, as young legislators do. But we had some interesting experiences. For the first 2 years I was in the legislature, the speaker invited a very select group to his birthday party. They would have just a private dinner and had a little country band, and the speaker would get up and sing Your Cheatin' Heart with the band and dance with his lady friend at the time. But it was a lot of fun. These 4 guys that became known as the 4 Horsemen, that we had tons of fun together and did a lot of interesting things and got involved in some interesting things.
You mentioned Ray Holland. Tell us about the Holland Manifesto.
Well, one of the things that the 4 years generated for all of us was a degree of excitement, challenge, and frustration. And the frustration centered on the progress path that we were on. Many of us realized, watching Terry Coleman and Larry Walker and Tom Buck and these guys who've been in the legislature for over 20 years finally get their committee chairmanships and are still hanging there waiting to ascend to the ultimate leadership post. And we're going like, I'm not going to be here 20 years. I want to actually get more involved now. So we started thinking about ways in which we could improve the mechanics of the House. And so Ray stayed focused on this. And we did several things, like, we all were early adopters of computers. We got elected because we used databases on these little new fancy things that were being used out there. And we got computers. And we asked to have those used to have ready access to information. Secondly, we had a degree of expectation on what legislation before us would be evaluated before we voted on it. Frequently a bill would get introduced, sent to committee, voted out of committee that afternoon, and it was on its fast track. It's on the floor a couple days later. You really haven't had a chance to study it, to vet it, to have public hearings. We just didn't think that was right. We felt like there were a lot of issues where we ought to put them out there early, let people debate them, have public sessions before we come into this abbreviated 40-day session and get it all done there. Some of us even felt like we ought to split the session into two parts. You could only introduce bills the first 20 days, take a 30-day break, and do the other 20 days broken into two pieces of 10 and 10 so that you could vet, have hearings on, and actually evaluate these bills before you actually passed them all the way through the process. Many nights on the last night of the session, it was a nightmare for the voters of Georgia because things that passed in the middle of the night with amendments in a conference committee report that nobody except the people who wrote it had ever read. And it's very frustrating, and we felt like that reform needed to be included. We did several things, but Ray Holland reduced them to writing. He focused on it, and just after I left office, they started pursuing these reforms after the couple of battles that we fought that I'm sure you'll want to talk a little bit about. With retail divorcement and then the ethics and government.
Yeah, well, let's talk about them now. You had several measures there, as I recall, ethics among them. You had some environmental legislation.
Well, I grew up on the coast. Environmental issues were important to us. I had a natural ally in Doug Teeper. He was an environmental activist. That was his role before he came to the legislature. I wasn't crazed about it. I wasn't a wild-eyed liberal environmental activist. I had major employers in my community, Sea Island Company, their major employer. I had Hercules, Georgia Pacific ultimately, major employers in my community, but the balance between the environmental sensitivity, we live in a very delicate environmental situation with the rivers and the marshes and the estuaries. It's very important for us to protect those marshlands. But at the same time, we had 800 jobs at one facility, 1,500 jobs at one, 1,200 at the other. And my challenge and my job was to represent my constituents. The last thing I wanted to do was put one of these companies out of business because of a simple environmental regulation, but at the same time, I wanted to protect the environment because the beauty of the Golden Isles is well known, and it's well known because we've protected it to some degree. Once Hercules and Georgia Pacific in their reign in Glenn County, that's going to be a total 100% tourist economy. Well, we can't yet afford that. And so we have to pay the bills, and this pays the bills and keeps people fed and keeps jobs in the community. Even our hometown boy, Pete Correll, grew up in Brunswick. He went on to run Georgia Pacific and in a terrific way relocated the company to Georgia, and it's a wonderful success story. And he still lives in the Golden Isles. He in addition to splitting time in Atlanta, he still lives on Sea Island in a house that we built. Fennel Construction Company built the house that he ended up buying from one of the Jones family members that we built it for. But the fact that I wanted to get involved. I was very interested in the river protection component, and there were several folks who had been working on this for years. So I came late to the party, but I was happy to be on the Natural Resources Committee, which I requested, and working with them to help fashion a bill. And Miller, on the Senate side, had a bill that was the Mountain Protection Act. And he felt very strongly, coming from the mountains, about that. So those two bills were merged ultimately in what became the River and Mountain Protection Act. And I was proud to be one of those who were co-signers on the beginning, and I sat on the committee that helped with the final versions of those bills. And it just was important. Natural resources was important to all of us. Mm-hmm. I served on Defense and Veterans Affairs. Didn't quite understand why I was appointed that, but it was one of the junior committees. I happened to enjoy it. McCracken Poston and I got a chance to serve on that. We studied the civil defense component. We actually learned about earthquakes. I don't know if you know, but Georgia has many earthquakes a year, minor tremors. But we got to go to Louisville, Kentucky to see the civil defense bunker just down the street from the state capitol underground. We've since instituted an awful lot of those things in Georgia for emergency conditions, and Georgia has a pretty extensive defense network and a civil defense component to what we do. Not many people talk about it, but Buzz Weiss could probably help you out on that. But that was one of the committees. But the one that I coveted most, and the Speaker was very kind to appoint me to, was the Transportation Committee. Because transportation was important to the whole state, but it was important to my area for two reasons. One, we had some small road issues with bridges, crossing over railroad tracks, crossing over these rivers to get to St. Simons and Jekyll Island. And we needed some state help to get these done. But the biggest one, we had been stymied by a political decision that had been made back in the 40s and 50s. And that was the location and construction of the Sidney Lanier Bridge across the Brunswick River. It was assured that Savannah as a port would grow and Brunswick would not by the location and the structure that was placed across that river. And I was going to make sure that if I had anything to do with it, before I left my time in public service, we would alter that opportunity and give Brunswick a chance to at least compete and breathe. And I'll go back to 1986. I remember when Reverend Tillman was running to get his third nomination. He had defeated me, and there was a fundraiser held at the Elks Lodge. Tom Murphy came down to help raise money for Reverend Tillman, and he stood in this hall, and 80 some odd Democrats gathered there to support the Reverend. And he said, "Folks, until you guys send me a Democrat, I can't really help you with any of your issues. So y'all better elect him." We didn't. 2 years later, fast forward, I win the election the next morning when Tom Murphy arrived at the state capitol with his Stetson and a cigar. I was sitting in his office waiting. He said, "Son, happy to see you. Congratulations. Saw where you won." I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker." He said, "So what is it you want?" He was very straightforward and very blunt about things like that. And if he told you something, it was bankable. And I said, "Mr. Speaker, it's just a little old bridge." And he smiled. He said, "I figured that's what it was. Let's see what we can do about it." I said, "Mr. Speaker, we've raised $2 million in commitments locally through the chamber and through the local governments. We can get more if we need to, but we wanted to come to the table with something besides just an ask and an emissary." And he said, "Well, I appreciate that. That helps a lot. We're going to work on it." And true to his word, he and Zell Miller made this happen for my community. There's a new bridge spanning that river, the Sidney Lanier Bridge Reborn. And it was a challenge. We worked for an awful long time and among a lot of folks. And I said, "Mr. Speaker, what do you need me to do? I'm a soldier here. You tell me what you need me to do." He said, "I need 100% of your delegation to vote for the budget." "Yes, sir, Mr. Speaker. I'm on it." Well, I had a Republican in my delegation named Willow Smith, a wonderful lady. Copeland was her maiden name. Her grandfather was the Coca-Cola bottler locally, so she never really had to do anything. public service was a calling, and she owned some Burger King franchises among other business interests, and her husband worked at Sea Island. Great people, and she was a true public servant and a great friend. But she was a Republican, and Johnny Isaacson, her leader in the caucus, made sure that no budget was being voted for by Republicans. It was a consistent pattern. Every year the Democrats propose a budget, the Republicans are going to vote against the budget every time. And it was almost unanimous every time. This one was different. And I'll never forget the day the vote occurred on the budget. I'm sitting in the back row, second to the back row, the old sawmill gang as it was called. And Willou sat on the opposite side of the aisle, third row from the back. And Johnny Isaacson, of course, the Republican leader, sat closer to the front on the aisle on the other side. And the speaker said, "All members voted? All members voted." We're all watching the board, and Willou's light was not yet lit. And the speaker was looking. I was looking at her. Johnny was looking down, and he was looking up at the board. And Willou put her head on her desk and put her finger on the green button as I was 2 paces away from my desk and as Johnny was 2 paces away from his desk. We were both headed for her, and she voted green, and the speaker said, "The clerk will lock the machine," and it was done.
Done deal.
And I met my commitment, Willou met her commitment, and we got our bridge in Brunswick. And Tom Murphy and Zell Miller and Terry Coleman and guys like that helped make that happen.
That's very interesting.
Yes.
Let's talk a minute about ethics.
Okay.
Your four horsemen had some ethics legislation, as I recall, that might have ruffled a few feathers in the House of Representatives.
Well, we were a different breed, these young guys, and I had seen things happen. The first time I ever met Tom Murphy, for example, I had seen him from afar, but I was working for Zell across the way, and I went to my very first Jefferson-Jackson dinner in 1980. The day of the event, everybody's buzzing, we're going to the event, we're going to the event. Well, I'm just a junior staffer on Zell's staff. I didn't have a ticket. Heck, I didn't have a tux. I only a couple of suits. So Cap Hicks said about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he said, "Son, you got a ticket for tonight's event?" I said, "No, sir, I don't." He said, "You do now." And he handed me a ticket. I was just over the moon. I'm going to the Jefferson-Jackson. I had no idea what to expect. So I go to this event. I show up a little early because I realized when I got to the check-in, everybody had a numbered table. You're supposed to know where you're sitting. Mine didn't have a number on it. Kappa just handed me this random ticket. So I walk in and I'm looking around for Cap to find out where my seat is. And as I walked in, Tom Murphy walked in the side door. And he walked over to where his table was, and he put something down there. And I said, "Hello, Mr. Speaker." And he said, "Son?" I said, "Have you seen Cap Hicks?" He said, "No." I said, "I'm just looking for my seat. I don't know where I'm supposed to sit." He said, "You don't have a seat?" I said, "Well, I've got a ticket, but I don't know where I'm supposed to sit." He said, "My wife wasn't feeling well tonight. She's not coming. Why don't you just sit here with me?" So my eyes bugged out. I'm not going to tell the man no. He's very kind to offer me a seat for his sick wife. So I dutifully plopped my butt down right there. Well, Miller comes in about a half an hour, 40 minutes later, sitting at a table, next table over, and, everybody's eating their salad, and he looks up and he looks over at me and he raised it up and looked at me like that, and I went like that, and he just shook his head. We never talked about it. But I told Cap later, I said, "I got this ticket this seat because the speaker asked me to sit down." Well, I tell you that story and to lead up to the ethics debate because I found the man to be polite, congenial, somewhat shy, a bit of an introvert, which was different than the public persona I had read about and seen and heard about through the rantings out of Miller's mouth, which was part of how that dynamic worked across the House and the Senate. But I had the opportunity that first couple of years to go through an awful lot of changes. We all did. We were taken out to dinner and out to lunch and different things, and a lot of people showered an awful lot of attention on us and a lot of benefit. Ken and I were invited down to the Masters by the phone company, and the oil companies before we even got elected, brought us into town to the Ritz-Carlton, took us down to the races. Texaco put us up in their private suite. We got to go down on the track and meet Davey Allison and Richard Petty, and you go down the list, they were all there, and we got to do that, and it was very heady stuff. Well, what we didn't know is we were being curried favor relative to protecting their interests. It's logical, but we just didn't realize it at the time. And we didn't realize we'd have to end up being on an issue, having to decide between various parties. And Ken had an issue with a local constituent problem with a guy who was a gas dealer selling fuel, and he was competing with a company store not far away. And so Ken was asked to try to make this right. Well, a lot of people got involved in this issue after Ken introduced his simple little bill to help his constituent. And they beat up an awful lot of people and tried to divide an awful lot of people and spent a ton of money. We didn't realize at the time how much or what they were spending money on, but after the fact, we heard these wild numbers, well over $1 million being spent on this one issue, on this one bill by the various constituencies, the association that represented all the oilmen and each of the oil companies, and it was bizarre. Ken and I went down to, when I say Ken, McCracken Poston, we call him Ken. He uses the last 3 letters of his first name. But we went down and Ken was asked to speak on the retail divorcement issue at a conference at Ponte Vedra, Sawgrass Resort. So we went down there, and we were each dating at the time. So we had an outing down on the coast. In the bar on Saturday night after his speech, after we had done all of our glad handing, they were having a special on mudslides. I don't know it's a chocolate liqueur, heavy layered drink. And we drank those till we got sick. Well, the next morning he was supposed to meet me for a foursome to play golf, and he didn't show. Well, when we made the turn, I came to check in. He was sick as a dog, and he ended up coming home that evening, and they admitted him straight to the hospital, and he was diagnosed diabetic. I nearly killed one of my best friends with this chocolate overdose that night and didn't realize it, and he didn't realize he was diabetic until that moment. But while he was recovering from this almost diabetic coma that we had put him in with these chocolate drinks, he started thinking about, because it was a life or death situation. They said, you were about to go blind. If you had not watched this, you could have been 3 more months. You'd have been irreversible. And so it scared all of us, him mostly, but it helped us understand some things. He had been getting assertive and challenging communications from folks. We're going to cut you off from going to these fun events, and you're going to be just banished and all this stuff. And so it started affecting him. Well, bottom line, he got a version of that bill passed, but while he went through all that and the health issues, it gave him a greater sense of where he was in life and what he wanted really to accomplish. And the fact that they were spending so much money on one issue, on one bill, and nobody knew how much, there was no reporting, he felt like it was crucial that we have some sort of reporting requirement, a basic ethics law where people could have some degree of confidence, create a committee that looked into challenges, and go out and tell the world that Georgia has this on the books. This person is trying to influence these legislators. They're spending this amount of money. If it's just dinner or a drink or whatever, it's fine. Just tell us what it is. We'll make up our own mind. So it wasn't nefarious. It was pretty straightforward. We thought it was sensible as the Young Turks. Yeah, ethics are important. Why wouldn't anybody be for ethics in government? Well, when he introduced this bill, there were a lot of folks who thought it was radioactive. They weren't going to touch it because they were disrupting the way of life. And I was a little reluctant at first, to be honest, because there are a lot of us who had hoped to be in the House for a number of years, and we wanted to work our way up the chain and be leadership positions as well. But it was obvious to me, I had been a Miller loyalist, so I wasn't going to be on Tom Murphy's priority list, Not that that was a bad thing, but it was obvious. And then secondly, when you're in the legislature and you're impatient like we were, they were more technical, strategic, and legislators. They wanted to pass bills. I wanted to help my folks. And I was less about writing laws than trying to repeal some. In fact, they chuckled at me whenever I told them that I thought we ought to, for every bill we introduced, we ought to repeal 2 laws until we ultimately can put ourselves out of business by having the one, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, and we'd be finished with the legislature. We wouldn't need this anymore. Yeah, they said, that's going to work there, non-lawyer. So they just dismissed me right out. That's fine. But Ken asked me, and I agreed to sign on. I'm the number 2 signer on the Ethics in Government Act. Ken took the bullets, the arrows, and led the way. I merely signed on and supported him the whole way. I gave a talk on the floor of the House. It was brief, but I showed support, and I even quoted Spike Lee, who was popular at that time with a movie that had just come out, and ended it with, just do the right thing. It was very straightforward. A reporter, an opinion maker for the local publication here in Atlanta, who's still working to this day, wrote a couple of paragraphs about my making remarks, and he attributed, he used the word bunk, like I had said virtually nothing and it meant nothing. He didn't bother to look that I was the number 2 signer on the bill. He thought I was just electioneering out of it. But nonetheless, that was the year I ran for Congress in 1992. But the Ethics in Government Act changed the way people looked at the legislature, at the leadership structure, and at how we interface with the lobbying community. A lot of really good people out in the halls who were telling their client's story, and all we were asking them to do was just put on the record what you're spending. We don't care how much it is. We're not asking for limits. We just want you to tell the public what you're doing.
You mentioned Murphy and Miller. Tell us about your experiences with our extinguished Lieutenant Governor and Murphy's mausoleum.
Well, let me give you one story from early on that I don't get a chance to tell. We're all freshmen. We're being feted by the speaker and the leadership. He sends word down, the 3 of us, Ken, Ray, and Ron. Speaker wants you to go to lunch with him today. So we jump in the car with Butch, who is the driver and the speaker, and we go to the Commerce Club. We sit in one of the little alcoves over there with our friend from Savannah's Mills picture on the wall. And we listen to Butch and he and one other fellow who had walked up chat about various issues, and then we talk about almost nothing the whole time. Have a nice lunch, eat our ice cream. We get in the car, and on the way back, I'm sitting in the right side, and Ray Holland's in the middle, and Ken's on the other side, and the speaker says, I think we ought to get Ray to go fishing with us this weekend, talking to Butch. And the speaker didn't think anything more about it, and Ray in the back perks up and said, "Me, Mr. Speaker?" He said, "No, Ray Goff." Talking about the coach. So we gave Ray a pretty hard time about that, still do to this day. But he said, "Can you talk to that friend of yours?" "You talking to me, Mr. Speaker?" "Yeah, that friend of yours across the hall. Can you talk to him?" I said, "What you want me to talk to him about, Mr. Speaker?" We were just getting out of the car at the Capitol. He said, "Come on in my office and I'll talk to you." And so just the 2 of us go into his office, and he gives me the message he wants me to deliver to Miller. And I'm going like, okay, there's a phone over there. Why don't you just pick up, I'm thinking to myself, why don't you just pick up the phone and call him? No, dutifully, yes sir, Mr. Speaker. And down I go, downstairs and over to the Lieutenant Governor's office, and I said, "Martha, I'm here to see the chief." And she said, "Well, he's on the phone, but he'll be off in a minute." I said, "Okay, I'll wait." So I waited. Said, "Okay, he'll see you now." I go in there. I said, "Chief, I don't know what this means, if anything, but I had lunch with Tom Murphy today, and he sent me over here to deliver a message, and here it is." So I delivered the message, and he says, "You tell Tom Murphy," and I said, hey, I'll tell him whatever you want, but I don't work for you anymore. I'm not on the staff. I'm an elected official. You tell Tom Murphy. So I had to become the relay guy that session because these two stubborn mules would not talk to one another on the phone. It's just one of those interesting moments that I had a chance and a privilege to be a part of. The two guys were so much alike, it was scary. Two old guard Southern Democrats, come from families where they had challenged circumstances growing up, but achieved beyond all measure of the obstacles in their way. Both had a feeling that the little guy needed fighting for, who, as North Georgians, I mean, the speaker was proud of going to North Georgia College and how he fought often to protect their interest and to grow the school and the legend behind it, and Miller about young Harris. And it was really a fun thing to watch the two of them very much alike, not getting along. Mm-hmm. But they ran the chambers. I mean, I watched Zell. I used that number 4 earlier. 4 votes. I served 4 years under Miller, 4 years at the Democratic Party, 4 years in the House, and 4 years at a trade association afterwards. And it seems like 4 is a common theme. But those two guys fought one another over the simplest things, and they ran each chamber virtually the same in some respects. I think Zell regretted his early days where he gave more power out to other folks, but he had seen what had happened prior to him, and he ultimately regained control, and Murphy kept control on his side of the aisle.
Don't you find it interesting that the current Republican Senate has done the same thing to the lieutenant governor?
Yes.
As Miller gave up freely
Yes.
when he was lieutenant governor?
It's very odd what's happened this time around, because a similar group did this, as you recall, to Mark Taylor when he became lieutenant governor, took the power of committee appointments and even assignment of bills away. Mark became a figurehead presiding officer and standing for photo ops. And it was very awkward. And I think this group of Republican leaders, there may be one in there who wants to challenge Casey for the nomination the next time around for governor, and they want to thwart his ability to reach the big chair. Fine. Mm-hmm. But there's an ambition in the group, but there's also a fear that they're all going to be brought down by some people's failings, and they watch some things that the outgoing governor has done that they haven't liked, and that the lieutenant governor was involved with that they didn't like. They're a little frightened at the news story surrounding the existing governor, and they feel that domino effect might just spoil their whole deal. But it does have a reminiscent quality to the Zell Miller giving up power voluntarily, but in this case, he had the opportunity over time with proper allies to get it back. I think he regretted what he did because there was more influence coming out of the second floor thereafter for a while. And by the time I came to work for him in '79, I think the compromise on the 2-term governor thing and no limits on lieutenant governor and those negotiations to get the power back made a huge difference in how he ran things. And I got to watch that up close for those 4 years, and it was interesting.
Similar also, I think, is the economic condition of the state.
Yes. From
when you were in the House and today.
Correct.
You had a special session, as I recall.
On the budget, absolutely. Uh-huh. We didn't realize the condition that we had when we first came aboard. But you remember there was an election in 1990, and in 1990, Miller was elected governor. Okay. There were only 3 of us in the House that were supporting Miller that year. Everybody else was either forced to support Bubba or they were supporting Johnny on the Republican ticket. I say forced to, they were encouraged to. Tom Murphy was very clear as to what he wanted without giving direct orders. It was a pretty unique, artful talent that he had. I don't think that's a good idea, boys. And that'd be pretty much the end of that. But when you have a budget crisis like that, you have an outgoing governor leaving no money in the reserves in the kitty, and then you have a downturn, yes, you're going to have to deal with some issues. I think this time around might be a little different in that the transition between the two governors is a lot more amicable, and it has less of that reserve robbing because we put some checks and balances in there after that occurrence before. But there are difficult decisions that have to be made in budget crises like that, and it tests the mettle of the leadership, but it also puts every member of the House and the Senate in an almost untenable position. You're forced under the balanced budget rule to have a balanced budget, but you're also telling your folks back home, I ain't raising your taxes. And then you have to go in there and you have to either cut folks, cut jobs, cut programs, or raise somebody's taxes, and it's very uncomfortable. And they're going to find that to be the case this time around as well.
One piece of legislation that I recall that you were very active in was the Solid Waste Management Act.
That's correct. Tires. We have an opportunity so rarely to deal with some environmental issues. We were facing a crisis. We were having some problems, and we needed to fund certain things that the environmental entities, and you recall back in the day, the regulator who was responsible for looking after protecting the environment and the guy issuing permits to businesses were two different people. And those were melded under the Reorganization Act of '72, and Miller actually pulled them back apart again ultimately once he became governor. But that was after some hue and cry, a lot of it contrived, but there was some degree. But the Solid Waste Management Act was an important element for us to address. We have finite real estate and a growing state. We have to manage our waste somehow. And for those of us who are on the Natural Resources Committee, we went and looked at the landfills. They said 5 years from now this will be filled and we can no longer add capacity. Here are the 15 other locations that are going to go offline in the next 15 years. What are you guys going to do about it? We have to permit things. We have to handle this solid waste, municipal waste. We have to handle sludge, all these things with toxins in it. Tires, you go through this entire list. So we had to get a handle on it, and we wrestled with a lot of knotty issues there. I'm not sure we totally solved some of the issues, but we at least got our arms around it and established a baseline to go forward.
Well, you and your fellow horsemen certainly had an impact on the legislature during your time you served. Allow me to read an excerpt from a House resolution passed on March the 6th, 1996. Whereas, said 4 horsemen have galloped through and trampled over custom, tradition, and convention, thereby redefining the role of the modern state legislator. Don't you think that that's true?
We might not have intentionally meant to be disrespectful. We might have been considered to be disrespectful. Our purpose was clear. We felt like young, energetic talent ought to have an opportunity to serve. We felt like conventional old methodologies for doing business might have met their final day, and that we ought to institute some new ways of looking at how we govern ourselves as a state. Ethics in Government Act, make it clear that we can pre-file bills, make some of the changes necessary to allow us to have access to ready information clearly, easily, and promptly. Give every member an opportunity to have their bill heard. Give the public an opportunity to hear what's going on as we decide these things. Stop all this middle-of-the-night amendments and backdoor dealing. We thought those were very common sense, rational, reasonable things. If we were defying convention, so be it. It was what we felt like the state deserved and earned, and we felt like the leadership would adopt many of these, and ironically, they did over time, but it had to be their idea. We learned some very valuable lessons as young, aggressive, maybe impolitic, behaviorists as we were. We were just impatient. We wanted it done and done now, and that's the idealism of youth. You recall Winston Churchill's famous quote, "If you're not a liberal when you're in your 20s, you have no heart. if you're not a conservative by the time you're 40, you have no brain. So we were learning along the way, tempering what we had gained as idealism in our 20s. Here we were in our early 30s, and we were trying to move the needle probably far more quickly than some of the others, and many others in the chamber, leaders who had been waiting their turn for 15 or more years, agreed with us. They just couldn't take the king out yet. And it made for an uncomfortable environment for an awful lot of them. But truth be told, we were being egged on by some of these guys. Yeah, keep going, keep going, keep going. But they couldn't say that publicly. They were in a system where they were trapped in this stair step to the top, and they all wanted to get there, and they didn't have any way out. But they did have a degree of power where they were. And so it was an interesting dichotomy for them. It was a frustrating challenge for us because we saw what our future looked like, and it was 15 years of stair stepping. That wasn't happening for us. Yeah. We weren't going to do that.
Well, what was the king's reaction, meaning Speaker Murphy, to your efforts?
I think he was hurt more than anything else. I think we hurt his feelings because he in his mind, he had done so much to embrace us and to bring us along and to show us that he cared about us and that he liked us. I don't think he disliked any of us. Well, Poston might have had a couple of times that tested him. But I think in the end, he appreciated what we were trying to do. He saw a little bit of himself in what we were doing from his early days. He was a rebel early on. Bob, you saw him early on. You know exactly the firebrand he was early on. I only read about it. You saw it. And we were doing many of the things that he would have done had he been in the legislature in a similar situation just like us. And we did it the right way. We offered legislation. We offered changes. We encouraged. We built consensus. We started doing the things. Ken was better at managing the media side of it because he became the lightning rod. I think, much to Murphy's chagrin, he sort of helped create that. And that foil became, a storyline that the press picked up on and lived on for 4 years or so. But for those of us who really wanted to just make change and improvement for the better, all we had to do was hearken back to Murphy's early history and Miller's early history and see that this is exactly what they would have been doing were they there at the time. And so we didn't feel like we were being radical or rude or crude or unusual. We were doing what we felt was right, and we were doing it in the way that we knew how at the time in the situation we were given. Now, I do think it hurt Murphy's feelings that he felt like we were being disrespectful to some extent as the way he was running the House. I have an awful lot of fondness and fond memories of Tom Murphy. He was kind and polite to me. I'll always give him credit for helping get my bridge and to remove the DOT commissioner that was not wanting to build a bridge the way we wanted it. He and Miller and Terry Coleman. But we had an opportunity, a rare opportunity. Here was a guy who had been the Speaker of the House for 25 years when we got there. I don't know how long any one person is supposed to have a job, but we only let our president and our governor serve 2 terms. Now, I'm not a term limits oriented person. I think the voters ought to have the opportunity, but I do think in leadership roles there are tons of talented people who have an opportunity, ought to have an opportunity to get a shot at showing what they can do and to helping lead the state. He was probably hurt that we were taking away something important to him, and he felt like in the environment he was in, he was the only one uniquely situated to handle the task. And maybe in some of those cases, maybe he was right, looking back at it.
What is the toughest vote you ever cast?
Well, it wasn't tough at the time, but it proved to be interesting for both Poston and I. The Speaker had a fight with West Point Pepperell. And a bill was offered that the Speaker wanted, and we felt like was anti-business. But the Speaker was making a point to a single company. I wasn't in on the back room meeting that told everybody that that was what it was about. So Poston and I were the only two who voted no out of 180 members on the Speaker's bill. It wasn't a tough vote to cast because I knew I was doing what was right, but in the end, it cost me with the Speaker, and looking back at it, I made my point, but I got nothing out of it with the Speaker in terms of standing up to him. And I didn't tell him in advance that I was going to do this. That probably more than anything else. Whenever I supported Miller for governor, I went to him in advance after the word had gone out that Bubba was going to run and he was supporting Bubba. I went to him ahead of time. I said, Mr. Speaker, you know that I worked for Zell for 4 years and I'm very fond of him and I think he'd make a great governor and I'm going to be out there supporting him. I just wanted you to know that so you didn't hear it from somewhere else. He said, I understand, son. I really appreciate you coming and telling me. And I never had a problem with him after that. The day after the election, I was at the Capitol and I had just gotten reelected to my second term, and I was at Zell Miller's victory party, standing on the stage behind him, and all the cameras rolling. And the next morning, I went by to see the Speaker. He'd asked me to come in there for something, and he said, "I saw you on TV last night with your friend." I said, "Well, we're really proud, Mr. Speaker. Looking forward to what lies ahead." He said, "He'll do fine," and that was it. But he acknowledged that early on, I had to be where I had to be, and he had no problem, and he didn't hold it against me.
They became good friends at that point.
Yes. It was important. They had so many similar experiences. The state was facing such crisis, and they understood that the leaders that they had become over time and what they knew way more than anybody else about how government worked, how this state was structured, how its finances were, and what the moment called for. And they had fought their battles as the leader of one chamber and then the other. Murphy understood. This guy now has a different job. I actually like the guy, and I know the guy knows what he's doing. I'm comfortable in the role he's now going to be playing. I'll turn my attention and go fight that other rascal across the hall just like I do all the time. And so it was fun to watch for some of us to see how they interacted with one another differently.
So you left the House to run for Congress. What
was I
prompted
thinking?
that decision?
My congressman for 10 years was a guy by the name of Bill Stuckey. My congressman for the next 10 years was a guy by the name of Bo Ginn. My congressman for the next 10 years was a fellow by the name of Lindsey Thomas. Lindsey Thomas announced the first week of January of 1992 that he was not running for re-election, that he had taken a job with the Atlanta Committee for the Olympic Games with his good friend Billy Payne, and he was going to help run the governmental affairs operation and help put on the world in a gaming operation in Atlanta, and he was leaving Congress after 10 years. Open seat. 10 years, 10 years, 10 years. I've served in the House for 4 years. I have some name recognition. I was on Miller's staff for 4 years. I was at the party for a number of years. Why not me? I never had a true ambition to be in Congress. I was interested in it, and I'd spent some time with Bo Ginn in Washington when he was there. I was in school with his daughter. I used to babysit his son on the weekends in Millen. Brian, who ironically in 1992 was a staff member of Lindsey Thomas and who ran that year in that race, and the two of us having a similar demographic profile, young, politically connected, worked in politics, knew the same people. He was from the north part of the district, and I was from the south part of the district. We, in essence, knocked each other out of the race. By running at the same time, we split the demographic. Barbara Christmas and the mayor of Hinesville out of nowhere ended up in the runoff, and Brian and I, with just a few hundred votes separating us, were third and fourth. Knocked each other out of the race, a field of 7. But the bottom line, I ran because I knew that it would be another 10 years before I could get a chance to serve. My colleague in the State House, Republican Jack Kingston, we were great friends, and we posed for pictures during the sessions, and we're looking forward to the general election campaign, him versus me. We know it's going to be a clean campaign because our families know each other. We're not going to say negative things about each other. We're just going to run on the issues. What distinguishes you from me on these issues? We were actually looking forward to the first positive race for a lot of people in a long time. Well, it was the year of the woman, 92. Did you get that memo? I didn't get that memo in time, apparently. And Barbara Christmas won that nomination and went on to lose to Jack Kingston, who ironically traveled around the district with a giant poster board with TV cameras in tow. On every courthouse steps, he signed this term limits pledge, 6 terms and out. That's 12 years. That was 18 years ago, and he is slated to be maybe the appropriations chairman come January because of his longevity in Congress. I told you 10 years. I saw 10, 10, 10. The next opportunity for me to run would probably be at least 10 years down the road. Well, it's been 18 and it's still not an open seat. So that was what prompted me. I felt like if I was ever going to take an opportunity. Let me give you this one little story as an aside. Everybody said, go, do it, run, except one person. One person. Out of the entire state of Georgia, everybody was encouraging to me except one person, the person I wanted most to say, yes, I'll help you. Zell Miller. The boys and I called the gang of 4 the boys. We went down to his office and I waited and I went in, just me, and sat down with him. And I told him what I wanted to do. This was right after Lindsay's announcement, and I had spent a few days making phone calls and talking to potential fundraisers and such. And I said, I'd like to run for this open seat in Congress, and I wanted to ask for your blessing and your support. He plopped down in that chair and he said, I can't do it. I said, I mean, it was just like you poured cold water on me. I was hurt to start with. He said, you can't hip us in Washington. I'll pick up that phone. Have I knocked your mic off? I'll pick up that phone right there and raise you $50,000 right now if you'll run for the state senate instead. He was the only person in the state of Georgia who wanted me to run for something other than what I was asking to run for. And you know what? The old codger was right. I've regretted that decision all this time. It cost me an awful lot of money of my family and friends to lose. And it knocked me out of politics for a while. And in fact, I have not run for office since. But it was important for him to be clear about doing that. This is where a true leader is. He said, you can help us more by being in the state senate. I would have walked into that state senate seat. The state senator at that time was weak. He was not well liked in the Senate, and he was disenfranchising people left and right at home. I could have beaten him easily, and I would have probably been there for a number of years. And you might not have heard about Lieutenant Governor Mark Taylor. You might have heard about somebody else. But it's one of those moments in time. I felt like I had to do it at the time. Like I said, we had already gone through this whole procedure, and I was pretty much done in the House after being the number 2 co-signer on the Ethics in Government Act. So I felt like it was an appropriate exit for me to take from the House.
Well, have you ruled out politics? Do you have any plans to run for public office again?
I'm not sure that that's in the near future for me. I wouldn't rule it out. I enjoy public service. I enjoy doing an awful lot of things to help other folks. And I've been doing that. Since I left the legislature, I spent a year totally away from politics, totally. And then I said, you know, I want to do something different than the home building business. I had spent 10 years with the family business, and I wanted to do something different. I was tired of chasing subcontractors down. It just didn't interest me anymore. My dad was a year away from retirement. He and I talked about it. I had the prospect of either replacing my dad's expertise, contacts, and the working relationship I had with him as he retired with somebody of seasoned nature like that to keep the business going, or I could fold the tent and move on, which is what we ultimately decided to do. We took 3 years and ratcheted down the company, but I wanted to do something different, something that was people-oriented, and I always wanted, having spent some time working for Miller in Atlanta, I wanted to make it in Atlanta, see what there was. It was growing fast. I knew there would be opportunities. I didn't necessarily want to, go work for corporate America and be, on this fast track to make $1 billion. That wasn't my mission. I wanted to help folks and do it in such a way as I could be around politics, I could help folks, and I could still survive. And so a Sea Island company called me and said, we have an issue that you would normally be helping us with in the legislature, but we can't seem to get help right now with our current delegation. We want you to help us. So I said, well, I'll come over and talk about it. I went over to Sea Island and we talked about it. And I had worked there as a young kid. I've worked summer jobs and I worked internship. I worked my way through college at Sea Island Company. I did everything in the hotel and the restaurant side of the business. Worked the beach club, the golf club on the weekend, bussing tables, every job you can imagine a young teenager would do to work in a hospitality business. And it was an awful lot of fun. The company was great to work for and with, and the people were ones that I became lifelong friends with. But when they asked me to come over and study an issue, it was an issue on workers' compensation insurance. They were self-insuring every employee at Sea Island. And they had set up this self-insured program, and they needed some help with the insurance commissioner and crafting the legislation to make sure that they were allowed to do what they had been doing. And so I came to the Capitol in '95. I'd left office in January of '93, so I let 2 years expire before I came back. And I helped redraft that section of the law on self-insurance funds and Georgia captives, domestic captive insurance companies for Sea Island. And I did that during the session of '95. And I liked it. I liked spending time in the atmosphere again, but I enjoyed representing folks that I had represented as an elected official, but just in a different capacity, articulating their views. And Sea Island Company was a member of the Georgia Hospitality and Travel Association, an umbrella group, and Bob King had lobbied me on a couple of issues over the time I was in the legislature, so I was familiar with him. Great guy, Georgia Tech product, family at Sea Island. His son still lives there today. But Bob said, I've got an opening coming up at my shop. The guy who is my vice president is taking the similar job at the American Hotel and Motel Association. So I went over and talked to him about it. Bottom line, we decided that we'd give it a try for 3 months to see what each one of us felt about the job and my performance and whether I liked it. And after 3 months, Bob felt like I had taken to it, and I kind of liked it, and so we agreed on some terms, and I spent nearly 4 years at the trade association, Georgia Hospitality and Travel Association. Mm-hmm. Bob hired me with the intent on allowing me to be the successor CEO to him when he retired, and he said it would be between 3 and 4 years. So at 3 years, Bob and I had this conversation. I said, are we needing to start this timeline of your retirement? And he said, I think I want to stick around another 3 or 4 more years. Well, that was my clear signal. It was time to exit. So we took several months over the course of that year. It was '98. And I said, I'll get you through the elections. I helped. Part of my role was an advocacy role. And so I actually put together the debate, the first debate that actually occurred that year of all 3 candidates for governor. Guy Milner, Jack Cashin, the Libertarian nominee, and Roy Barnes. Mm-hmm. And it was well televised. It was a great event. I gave a package of material to each of the candidates and then allowed them to ask each other a question, and it was a ton of fun. But I left there and started my own business in the consulting business, and brought that client along with the workers' comp client from Sea Island. Those were my first 2 clients, and I did that for a year until I partnered up with a young man who had been the executive director of the Republican Party of Georgia, John Teasley. We were both on the food bank board at the time, and during the breaks in a planning session, he and I were talking about how we left our longtime employer and started our own consulting business, and we were finding some of the same problems. How do you get insurance, workers' comp? What do you do about, office space, phones. We were sharing some of these same war stories. Well, the irony was, he was executive director of the Republican Party the year I defeated the only incumbent Republican. He hated me for years before he ever met me. And the irony was that we ended up being partners and true friends, and 18 months later he was dead of cancer at 47. But we started a company together called Georgia Capital Associates. With his Republican Rolodex and my Democratic Rolodex, it was a good fit, and we had an awful lot of clients. And we had some interesting people come through our shop. We had John Stuckey, the Republican Party chair, Gene Stuckey, the former Democratic National Committee Finance member and a long-time Dodge County Politico. We had several people come through the shop, including Rich Golick, who worked in the law firm side under Stuckey, who's ended up being the floor leader for the governor, et cetera, and a number of other people. Megan Middleton, who is now the chief lobbyist, internal lobbyist, manager of governmental affairs for the city of Atlanta under Shirley Franklin and now Kasim Reed. Elmer Stansel worked for me for a while. He's now the governmental affairs guy for the Department of Economic Development. Just an awful lot of really interesting people that we had a chance to work with and clients that we worked with. But that's what I've been doing since the legislature, helping clients, a variety of clients. I still have the hotel industry and restaurant industry as clients as well. So it's an awful lot.
How is Georgia doing nowadays in the tourism and hospitality business?
Well, we had 2 times over the last decade, the 9/11 stopped everybody from flying, so that hurt our business an awful lot. And then this downturn in the economy, we experienced a little bit of a dip, but we're on the way back. We have a growing hospitality. We have 125,000 hotel rooms in Georgia, and we do an annual occupancy at 60% or a little bit better. So every night there are that many people, some 100 and some odd thousand people a night staying with us on average, and some nights we sell out. And then we have, we serve meals. There are 10 million Georgians, 12 million. We have 6 to 8 million visitors. We're serving 10 to 20 million meals, depending upon what conservative or average measure you can make, a day in our food service establishments, and you don't hear of any foodborne outbreaks, so we're doing well. We're turning over the dollars. Local and state government relies heavily on the World Congress Center as a draw, the Georgia International Convention Center, the Cobb Galleria, the Savannah Maritime Trade Center, the other locations around the state. So we have a vibrant tourism economy, and we're second only to agribusiness as a revenue stream for the state of Georgia, and we're very cash flow, near-term oriented. So if the planes quit flying, the state of Georgia gets a real problem on its hands with its cash flow. And so our job is to make sure that airport continues to have them lift off every 30 seconds and that they keep landing, and that their tourism product in town is fresh, is appealing, attractive, and that we have good customer service in our hotels, restaurants, and other attractions.
Some people believe that casino gambling would be profitable in the city of Atlanta.
Probably would be. Other states have done it. I don't think you want to rely on it. I don't think you want to budget against it. But I think the reality is that if you look at the number of tags at any of the casinos in our neighboring states of Mississippi and Tennessee, at those places that where rubber tire market, that's what we call the cars traveling to visit another destination. Look at those car tags. Look at the destinations for some of these aircraft leaving out of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Tunica, Mississippi is a nice hot spot. All these places in Alabama. Las Vegas is huge. We do spend money as Georgians on such things. Miller understood this whenever he established the lottery, and he had a focused purpose for the revenues derived to fund education. Brilliant. That ought to be the same model for any future opportunity, and I think the new governor is going to have to take a look at that, because for the first time in the upcoming fall semester, there is a potential shortage of money available for scholarships that we've promised to these students. I think we're going to have a fund shortage in the lottery account for the first time. We're going to have to replace revenue. We're going to have to either tighten standards or replace revenue. You tell me which. And I think that's a very tough decision the upcoming legislature and the upcoming administration are going to have to deal with. Governor-elect Deal has said that he has an open mind and an ear to any of these suggestions. So we'll see. They have to make the decision collectively.
How about horse racing?
I'm for it. We have a lot of horse flesh in the state of Georgia, a lot of people who understand horses, who raise them, who train them, who stable them, who care for them. I'm baffled, frankly, that the outgoing governor, whose degree from the university is in large animal veterinary, and he understands horses better than anybody, why he wouldn't have allowed the voters to consider that option. I'm baffled, frankly, by that. And it's going to have to be considered by the next administration. I know we've been talking about it for 40, 50 years in this state, but folks are going to go to Kentucky or elsewhere to spend their money if that's what they want, is the horse racing. But remember, that's only a small sliver of the revenue opportunity in that business. The rearing of quality horse flesh and marketing and branding them as Georgia raised and stabling and training and that sort of thing is a huge industry. We have a great amount of real estate in the state of Georgia. We have a lot of quality locations for making these things work. And we're tourism oriented, we're growing fast in that. And agribusiness is number one, tourism is number two. This marries those two entities of revenue streams for the state of Georgia in one activity. It makes way too much sense for us not to give serious consideration to.
Let me ask you this question. Which political figure do you most admire and why?
Well, this is probably the easiest question I've been asked in a while. And it's Zell Miller, because I've seen him up close and personal. I haven't always liked things I've seen from a distance, but I'm extremely fond of him as a person and his principles. And I watched a lot of things happen without realizing at the time what I was learning. But I've replicated an awful lot of those things in my life, and I've seen mistakes that have been made, and I've tried to avoid those. I've made mistakes. He ran for Congress 3 times and lost. At least I had sense enough to stop at 1. Sorry, Governor. But it was, for me, the best learning that I could have ever hoped for at that time in my life. I think he has been, after his political career, he has been dissected in so many different ways by others, and many of them have hit the nail on the head. There's a guy who's fairly principled. There was a seminal moment in his life and in his political life where things changed right there. The Daschle and Biden lunch, the bombing of the World Trade Center, the moments in time where you say, okay, I don't have to answer to anybody anymore. I'm going to be who I truly am inside, and I'm going to say whatever the hell I want. And I admire him for that. He's a courageous fellow, and it was an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to learn with him over time.
That reminds me of the famous Herman Talmadge story about when he was defeated and was walking down the street one day, and a fellow walks up to him and said, "Senator, I bet you don't remember me, do you?" And Talmadge replied, "Hell no, and I don't have to anymore."
That Senate campaign of 1980 with Herman Talmadge was a sad thing for me to watch up close. I traveled with Zell once to the Jekyll Island Convention Center, where we appeared in front of different groups, and we did it 3 or 4 times, I guess. We showed up one time. I drove up, and Dawson, it was the JC's convention. And Dawson Mathis was there in his big RV that he had his big face painted on, Dawson Mathis for the U.S. Senate. And Zell chuckled when we drove up. He said, "It figures he's your old nut." And when we got out of the car, he said, "Let's go over there," and knocked on the door, and Dawson came, opened the door, and he was all rumpled, and it was obvious he had been awakened. To watch that interaction between these two longtime buddies just jibe one another was a lot of fun. But later that summer, when we had Herman Talmadge on the program at the Aquarama, and after the speech, I drove Zell to the little airport over there on Jekyll Island, and someone had dropped off Senator Talmadge, and he was waiting on his plane to arrive to pick him up. And we were there to load up and send him on, and I was driving separately. I was just putting Miller on the plane. And Talmadge was sitting there in the lobby, and he had his shoe up, and he was picking at a hole in the bottom of his shoe. I wish I had a picture of that. It's framed in my mind of him with a shoe he had worn a hole in. At the end of his political career, it was sort of a melancholy statement in one visual shot that's seared on my brain. And he was alone and looked forlorn in that moment. And I heard a story many months later about an aide who pointed out to him that he needed to replace his shoes. He had worn those, and the senator said, "Okay, these are still fine, I just need them fixed." He said, "No, you need a new pair of shoes, Senator, it's time." And he took a $10 bill out of his wallet to give to the aide to go get him a pair of shoes. That's how disconnected, ultimately, from the real world that 23-year political career had insulated him to be. Yeah. And that snapshot was reinforced in my brain with that commentary from a staffer of him sitting there picking a hole in the bottom of his shoe at that little airport in 1980. It was interesting.
Ron, looking back on your political career, what was your proudest moment?
Getting a new bridge for my community. It will endure for 50 to 100 years. A lot of people wanted to see Brunswick prosper. And we knew that as a port city, there are only three ways to prosper. Number one, you can import. Number two, you can export. Or number three, you can fill it up with jobs that are probably not advantageous to your community, like paper mills and such. Because our bridge blocked our port for 50 years, we were unable to get a port traffic that generated enough activity to make it profitable. We got paper mills instead. And over the next 100 years, my hometown, thanks to the good folks who helped support it along the way, it started with Lindsey Thomas, and Jack Kingston helped us an awful lot once it got to the federal level, but Tom Murphy, Zell Miller, Terry Coleman, these guys, Joe Kennedy, these guys at the state level helped an awful lot after the local community did two crucial things. Number one, they committed $2 million in front-loaded funding, and number two, they sent a Democrat to the legislature because that's what Tom Murphy needed. In social groups and in civic clubs, I used the phrase that I had learned as a valuable lesson about whenever I was in party politics prior to getting elected. And I said, if you want to get an audience with the Pope, you're not going to send your Baptist minister. That's it. I'm a Democrat. The leadership are Democrats. I know them, they know me, and I've offered myself. And they said if we send a Democrat, we'll get a little attention and maybe something of what we want. And so getting that bridge was the seminal moment in my career. I'm very proud of it. It's in my wedding pictures, by the way. I got married on Jekyll Island under the giant oak at the Jekyll Island Club, and the bridge is framed in the pictures behind.
That's neat.
Yes.
What was your biggest disappointment?
Well, I think I just shared it with the Zell Miller story about my congressional run as my biggest disappointment while I was in the legislature. But as a legislative disappointment, probably how the ethics process unfolded and what it did to an awful lot of people that I had a great deal of respect for, and how they treated those of us who were upstarts and energetic, ambitious, and maybe too aggressive young Democrats.
How would you like to be remembered?
Well, you know, everybody wants to know that they made a difference while they were here. I like to think that those of us who get involved in public service feel like we can help an awful lot of people and not get the credit. And there are an awful lot of people who demand the credit for doing nothing. And for those of us who truly believe in public service, and I've worked for nonprofits and I've worked as a public servant, both in staff positions and elected positions and appointed positions, and in all of those I felt like I was able to be a part of helping somebody or some group or some larger thing. I just like for people to say, you know, he was a good guy and he tried to help folks.
Well, you certainly had a wonderful political career and are doing well in your after political life. I'm sure there's something we've left out.
Well, I'm blessed to have a wonderful wife and a pair of young sons that I hope one day will find it interesting to look back on Dad's career and projects like this, so they can see and hear stories about the times that I was involved with and excited about and how I tried to make a difference. But it's interesting that my wife, and I probably ought to get this story on the record. I related to you earlier about my business partnership with a Republican, the Republican Party executive director. John Teasley hated me for the first few years he had heard my name because I defeated an incumbent while he was executive director. When we finally met, we realized, each of us, that we seemed to be all right guys and we had a lot in common, and we had come from similar humble backgrounds, he from Columbus, me from Odom, and ultimately Brunswick. And it made for conversations that you don't normally have with folks that you're considered enemies with. But once we formed our business partnership and we started growing the business, and his diagnosis with cancer evidence then went into going to MD Anderson and getting the cancer treatment, I really lost a brand new friend very quickly, and it was kind of a tragic thing. Those of us who cared about him, once he learned he was ill, he married his girlfriend of 4 years. And that 18 months, the last 18 months of his life, he was married. And those of us who cared about him checked on his widow after his passing. I got a call one day and his widow says, hey, there's a little gathering at my house this afternoon for cocktails, can you come by? Sure, I went by, had cocktails, met a lot of folks, very nice folks. Stayed about 45 minutes and I had a date that night, so off I went. And about 2 weeks later, I get another call. Well, there's cocktails again 2 nights from now, can you come? Sure, I'll come. And I went by there. And no more than 5 minutes after I got in there and said hello to some of the same people, it was just the two of us left. Everybody bolted. I said, well, it's early, I'm hungry. Are you hungry? And we went out to dinner. Bottom line, 3 years later, we were married, and we've been together for almost 8 years. It was very odd that that relationship would grow out of that partnership and that odd thing. Well, before John passed away, he was very close to Paul Coverdale, and he helped Paul get elected. He was such a big fan of Paul Coverdale's. And I had known Paul from days in the state Senate, and a lot of interesting characters in the state Senate whenever I worked for Zell. There was a guy named Roy Barnes, I don't know whatever happened to him. A guy named Nathan Deal came along there, and different interesting people at the time. But Paul Coverdale was one of those guys, and he was kind of the leader of the Senate. Very few Republicans at the time in the Senate. But John was proud to help Paul get elected to the U.S. Senate. And then when he passed away so suddenly, the irony upon irony, his political hero, Paul Coverdale, getting elected, then my political mentor, Zell Miller, replacing him. Now here's what's even more ironic. Take 3 months step back from when Paul Coverdale died. That's when John died. Paul gave the eulogy at John's funeral. So in a 4-month period of time, I lost one of my good friends. His political mentor died, and my political mentor took his place. It was very strange. And it was during that period of time when I met and ultimately grew to fall in love with the woman that would be my wife. It's one of those moments in time that kind of chokes you up when you look back at it, and it's rather interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah, a lot of fun being involved in politics in Georgia, and if people have an interest in it, they always have an opportunity. I hired 2 young men whenever I ran for Congress that I had in my office in Brunswick, and 1 young man that I had that worked in my office in Statesboro. The 2 young men that worked in my Brunswick office, Peter Kennedy, who went on to be Pierre Howard's press secretary when he was lieutenant governor, Phil Smith, I hired off of the University of Georgia campus, president of the Young Democrats. He had worked for Doug Bernard and a couple of others, but he worked for me for 3 years and managed my congressional campaign later. He is the Southeast director for the Concord Coalition, the debt reduction crowd now. And the 3rd young man that I hired to run my Statesboro North District office was a guy named Chris Clark. And he came on as an aide, a driver. He asked me how I did it with Zell Miller and how I could get close to somebody. And I recommended if the guy's running for something or if he's going to meetings, volunteer to be a driver. Be with the guy. Be in the room. Volunteer. Do whatever you can. And he did so for a guy named George Sonny Perdue. And he rode through that and he worked his way up. He served 3 posts in the Governor Perdue's administration, GFA, DNR, and he served another post. And he now is the president and CEO of the Georgia Chamber of Commerce. These were young people who had an interest in serving, looking for an avenue to serve. I needed talent at the time, just like Zell Miller hired me. I was cheap talent at the time and raw talent. But these young men they're out there. They're juniors and seniors at colleges and universities all over the state right now. They're looking for an opportunity to get involved, and I just encourage every one of them to just tap into the resources of the existing establishment, attach like a tick and move and stay with it and go learn, because there is a wealth of knowledge and a ton of fun being involved in helping other people. And politics is a great way to do it. And it has been an avocation. It's been a vocation for me part of the time. And now, in addition to my real estate and my nonprofit work, I help advocate for companies and for associations and folks to make sure that government and business don't run afoul of one another, and they understand each other's rules and they try to help each other. I don't spend money like some of these big shot lobbyists who entertain an awful lot. I just articulate the views and the importance of rational positions, and I'm a source of information, and that's fine for me. I'm enjoying it.
Thanks very much, Ron Fennel.
Thank you, Bob.